Welcome to the WanderLearn podcast. I'm your host, Tapon. In this episode, it's a fascinating discussion with Derek Loudermilk. He is the guy who runs the podcast and the website, The Art of Adventure. And the funny thing is that we go completely off topic. We're going to talk about his book, Superconductors, which I read, which I enjoyed. But instead, we talked about aliens and crop circles and supernatural stuff and metaphysics. Completely went off topic. And if you want to hear talking about adventure stuff, go listen to my podcast where I appear on his show, The Art of the Adventure. But this show is about a skeptic meeting a believer about the supernatural. Tell me what you think. What side do you fall on? And if you'd like to hear more episodes like this, let me know. And don't forget to check out patreon.com/ftapon, as well as signing up for my newsletter at wanderlearn.com. So you wrote a book called Superconductors, and it's not about physics. So tell us a little bit about it.
I know, the funny thing is, it was going to be called Conductors, and my publisher said, "Well, let's make it super, and that'll probably sell more books." And I was like, "Great!" I know nothing about superconductors. In the physics term, I had to look it up. I was like, if I have a book called Superconductors, someone's going to ask me like, "What is a superconductor?" Actually, I probably couldn't tell you right now, but so I looked it up and I was like, it's unrelated. But superconductors. So the idea is, how can you get big things done? It's leveraging human skills and your ability to sort of coordinate groups of technology and people. So it's sort of the next level of being good at one specific niche or subject area, and I think that's where careers and business and everything is moving. So I wanted to write the book to help people with that.
Excellent. And your specialty, one of the things that you talked about is with Malcolm Gladwell, for example. He has this 10,000 hours. You become an expert at something, and you're like, "Oh yeah, fuck you, Malcolm Gladwell. I could do it in 100." Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I think for most people, 100 hours of dedicated practice. And so this is, if you really apply yourself and don't see what a lot of people do when they try to learn something is they get sort of good at one skill, and then they practice that over and over because it feels good to practice something you're already good at, but you don't progress any further with that. So maybe people will practice something like, and this actually happens to me with instruments. I'll learn one song and then kind of just play that song forever and ever. But if you really want to become valuable in a marketplace, sort of in a career, or if you want to get towards where you're much more in a rarefied air, you're in the top 95% in the world, it takes this progression. And you can do that in 100 hours if you have well-crafted practice, which means you're continually assessing where you are and challenging yourself to move 1% better each time you sit down to train something. And so you can have a ton of progression in 100 hours and get really good at a skill, whether it's chess or public speaking or emotional intelligence, or any of these things. Like if you are really okay with being uncomfortable and being sort of off balance and a beginner, and that feels really icky for a lot of people, which is why people don't progress super fast in learning. But learning quickly and getting to world class quickly is like the meta skill that unlocks so many other things.
Right. Now, let's use a practical example. Aliens, UFOs. You told me before we went on that you spent about 500 hours. So you're about 500 times better than Malcolm Gladwell about this. He doesn't know jack shit about aliens, and you know a little bit more. So tell us about how did you apply your process about the 1%, 1%? Did you apply it for this or not necessarily?
No, I wasn't really applying it. This is more like the difference between reading a novel and reading a nonfiction book, whether you're in one, you're just sort of expanding your enjoyment and experience, and in another, you're like trying to get a specific piece of information that you can apply. So you read a book about selling so you can be a better salesperson or something. So this isn't necessarily applied yet, but there's this sort of immersion approach that I advise people, if they want to get to the sort of the cutting edge or the place where they can be creative, you need to sort of really fully understand the field. And this is what I got from being a scientist, was that I had to read, let's say 300 papers and spend a couple of years like talking to scientists in my field of virology before I understood exactly where the limits of our research was and sort of like where the opportunity for me to create new work. And so understanding the cutting edge is best done, I think, through immersion. And then, so there's this, like, you read a lot of books, you listen to a lot of interviews, you watch a lot of videos, and then you sort of understand where things are. And then you can start to be creative and brainstorm new ideas. Okay, I can combine an interest that I have and knowing that nobody's really looked in this particular direction, then you can go that way. And that's when you start to get creative and sort of control your own destiny, which is also economically valuable.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Now, you got me excited when you told me about your virology, which is related to aliens as well. But before we get into aliens, since we are in the middle of the corona apocalypse, what is your take about this whole virus that's going through this whole thing?
Honestly, I haven't really gotten too engaged in it. And, there are so many things going on around me. There's also the city that I live in has, a lot of gun violence. And there's people starving. There's, disasters everywhere. The pandemic isn't the only thing that's happening. And so what's really important is what you let pertain to you. And you can go down any rabbit hole. You can go down a pandemic rabbit hole or politics or environmentalism or whatever, if you let it matter to you. But if it doesn't pertain to you, then it doesn't have to affect you. It doesn't have to affect your thoughts, and you don't have to take on any of the toxicity of the news cycle or the despair that other people are experiencing. And so that's kind of where I've been operating from is, yes, I see that it's affecting my country and the world. I think there's a lot of great things that will happen from it. And also, I'm not really letting it be part of my thoughts too much.
Got it. Interesting, especially for a virologist. You would think that you would be obsessed about this thing. All of a sudden, like, this is my time to shine. Yes, I've been waiting for all my life for this pandemic to hit us, and now is our chance. And so you would be obsessed. But it's interesting. You're kind of almost detached to a certain extent.
Yeah, and so my viruses were not human viruses. So I was interested in the beginnings of life on the planet, or the beginnings of life in general. And so we were looking at, how did the earliest viruses develop? How did we make this sort of switch from non-living to living? And so that's what I was interested in. So I was looking in the hot springs in Yellowstone, boiling acid, the most extreme conditions. And I ended up discovering a virus that infects a single-celled microbe that lives in these hot springs.
Wow, that's amazing. Because already a virus is super tiny, and then you're getting into a microbe and infecting it. That could be, because a virus is not. It's debatable whether it's a living thing or not, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate, and what I tell people is that it's sometimes living,
right?
when it's inside of a cell replicating and growing, then let's call that the living phase. And when it's just a particle, it's just basically like imagine a soccer ball or an M&M, right? The outside shell, and then the DNA or RNA is on the inside, and that's really all it is. And so in that sense, it's just a particle, but it's got so much information inside of it that it can, obviously cause a pandemic, which is super fascinating. It's so simple. It's like, because it's not always living, it's such a great step towards looking at what were the beginnings of life.
So what are the modern theories about how life got started? Because I think one of the challenges, and I think Richard Dawkins talks about this a little bit, is like, how do we all of a sudden have DNA? And I think if people are very religious and believing that, God just started things by fiat, that this would be a wonderful argument, which they almost never use. Creationists almost never use this argument, but they should. They should say, well, how did DNA just come to be? Like, boom, we don't have any precursors. I mean, unless it was RNA, but RNA is also a pretty complex thing as well. And RNA just doesn't, or DNA just doesn't spontaneously erupt out of nowhere. So either it's panspermia, that's one idea, but I guess but Richard Dawkins kind of, I think what he made this sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that his idea was that we had a self-replicating, very basic self-replicating organism of some sort early on, and they became more and more complex. But once we got to there, then DNA kind of got rid of or replaced, and so all those, there's no vestiges, no leftovers of those original self-replicating organisms. They're all gone. They're extinct because they've been replaced by DNA. So all we see now is the final evolutionary product. We don't see those original things. So what is your take?
Well, so there still is, and you can see self-replicating RNA molecules. So an RNA molecule is basically single-stranded instead of like DNA, and it can fold in such a way that it's like a protein. So it has some properties of a protein or an enzyme, but it also encodes genetic information. And so that's sort of like a precursor to a virus, is a self-replicating RNA molecule. And so the precursor to that is sort of free nucleotides and amino acids interacting, which you can sort of get if you apply electricity to sort of, primordial ocean, which they've done this experiment. And, that experiment didn't create genetic material, but it created the sort of the building block. So yeah, there's a lot of steps that you're like, there's still this would have to happen if this were to be true. And, the panspermia idea is really interesting, because take, for example, if you have, let's say, life on Earth, and you want to have life on Mars, or life on Mars and life on Earth, if a asteroid hits the Earth and shoots off projected matter, then you could have another asteroid go from Earth to Mars and sort of colonize Mars. So that's, there's enough exchange that could be possible. And, I think there's just so much that we don't know. And so coming back to aliens and understanding different dimensionalities and life that perhaps exists with different frequencies or different vibrations that we can't see sort of in this three-dimensional, DNA is supposedly interesting because it's a type of a molecule that shows up across dimensions. So I think there's potential for life in a bunch of different manners than we can even try to understand at this point.
Okay, so you're saying that our definition of life is way too narrow?
So one thing I've heard is that, if everything in the universe, and this is shown in physics, is, frequency and vibration and fields, then you can have entities that exist outside of a 3D reality in either like a sound field or a light field or a plasma field, and they could be making a living. They could be, living entities that operate totally differently than we do as biological, carbon-based life forms.
Give me an example, kind of like.
So angels, a lot of people see or are familiar with the concept of angels, and really my understanding, based on again these 500 hours of different interviews that I've started watching, is that they're probably beings that exist normally in a plane based on light, but they can take a physical 3D form in order to interact with us on this Earth dimension. And so when you see sort of angels coming down, they have, as they move from sort of one vibrational frequency and use basically their consciousness to shift into a frequency that allows us to interact with them, that's when they sort of have this great glowing appearance to us.
So are you mentioning this, is it as a scientist who's trying to explain the phenomena of angels, or are you approaching it from a religious perspective because, let's say, whatever religion you're from, that you're kind of trying to explain it that way? What is your tack there?
Yeah, I guess I do like to have scientific explanations for things. The really hard part is a lot of measurable things. You can't, like, we haven't caught up with a lot of things in terms of being able to measure it. So at some point, right, you can observe phenomenon, right? Like, so let me say, like, the whole reason I got into this is because I started having dreams about crop circles. And crop circles they're beautiful, they're fascinating. And as I started diving into like, oh, there's actually like tens of thousands of crop circles, and they have very specific geometric codes, and there's all these like really interesting things about crop circles that basically proved to me that they're not made by, a guy like doing a hoax, that they're created by some other phenomenon. And so as I started to, like go down this rabbit hole of UFOs, and then learning about interdimensional beings and all of these things, I started looking for, like, can I apply any of the science that I know and understand to these phenomena? And sometimes you can. Sometimes there's, basic physics experiments that show, like the double slit experiment is probably the most credible one, that shows our thoughts bend material reality. So we can create the physical world with our consciousness, and which is, that's super cool, right? Proven with science now. There's just, it's like such a infinitely new place to explore. Like, I don't even know how to design experiments or how to think about a lot of these things. Like, how can you prove angels? Like, let's say an angel comes to you in your room, right? Or some other entity, like a gray alien comes to you. Like, other than, there's so many different levels, right? Like people have their stories. Like, there's thousands of people that have stories of alien abductions and things, but how much of that can you sort of study scientifically, and how much do you need just to take as anecdotal evidence?
Right.
It's a gray area for sure.
It is tough, I think, a very difficult field, primarily because there are so many hoaxes, legitimate hoaxes. I mean, there have been people being filmed at night with night vision cameras cutting crop circles. And so we know for a fact that some of the crop circles are certainly man-made. But does that mean that they're all man-made? Not necessarily. Similarly, we also know that there's alien abduction stories and all sorts of other, UFO sightings that are hoaxes. We know that for a fact. Same thing with the Loch Ness Monster, was that picture that's so famous for the Loch Ness Monsters. We know it was a hoax. The guy who took it admitted to it. So as a result, that kind of pours a lot of cold water on those people who want to study it and see if all of them are hoaxes or can be explained away, or is there actually something real there behind it all? And that's a tough job.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that there's been this since essentially the 60s, like a huge campaign to discredit anybody who tries to investigate. So scientific or journalistic, or just somebody who experienced something and they want to talk about it. Like, there's the bit, media and or intelligence sort of says like, this person's crazy, and it shuts them down and they get kicked out of their communities. So this is unfortunate. Like, when people are trying to do fringe scientific research, that ultimately leads to an expansion of knowledge. A lot of times people say they're crazy for a while. And this, since Galileo, since Copernicus, this has been happening. So it's not a new phenomenon, but it takes a brave person to say like, here's what I've discovered, even though it's totally crazy. And then eventually, that becomes an accepted truth.
Right. And that's the challenge I think you're facing as just, somebody who investigates this, because you wonder, like, am I the Copernicus of my age? In other words, am I seeing something that nobody else sees and is not obvious right now, but it will become eventually obvious in a few centuries or whatever, once we kind of really hone this in? Or am I just another person who's believing antiquated thoughts, and I'm just still haven't accepted that it's disproven? For example, there's a lot of beliefs that people had in Aristotle's time. Aristotle believed a bunch of shit that's just not true. How he believed that the elements were earth, wind, and fire, and all this kind of stuff. They had a ton of beliefs that were eventually disproven. And so you wonder, like, what side of the fence are you going to end up on?
Sure. And then there's this, take something that was like popular and then unpopular and now has come back, which is the concept of an ether.
Right.
that pervades the universe. And so perhaps this ether is something like a unifying force that combines gravity and electromagnetism. And perhaps they're actually two different aspects of the same ether. And so you never know, like if a concept is
the classic one.
Recycle. Yeah.
The classic one is Einstein when he had his cosmological constant, which he called his greatest blunder of his entire life. And then now we're kind of wondering, well, maybe there is a cosmological constant actually in the end.
Yeah. But it's also just really fascinating. Like, when you can start to draw parallels between, let's say, hundreds of native cultures and, modern physics, if they're saying like similar things, like, okay, here's how a wormhole is possible. And then you have a story from the Hopi Indians, like for the last 1,000 years, you go to this place and there's a wormhole that appears on certain times of the year and you can step through it and you can time travel through this portal. And you're like, okay, so what does my modern understanding of physics line up with all these like ancient stories? And I like to, I haven't sort of fully published or talked about it. This is actually probably the most I've sort of been able to talk publicly about this. I, introduce it slowly, but I think there's just like a great chance to unify so many different things here in a sort of a model of reality.
So what's your current thinking about UFOs and aliens life?
Yeah. And so this is largely based off what I would say is, 100 or so interviews with people who have interacted with extraterrestrials or extra dimensionals. At this point, I would say there's, for me, there's 100% certainty that they're here right now. And there may be some in the room with us right now, but on a different frequency, and we wouldn't be able to interact with them. They may be on a different timeline. They also may just be sort of like slightly out of phase with our material world, and we wouldn't be able to interact. So there's just, potential for so much. But what I've come to understand is that the Germans were the first to start interacting with, physical extraterrestrials that came here to help humanity in the 30s. And that since then, most of the nations of the world have had programs of interaction with extraterrestrials. Okay,
so why wouldn't it have happened earlier? I mean, some people say the extraterrestrials helped the Egyptians build the pyramids, for example.
Sure. Yes. And I would say, yeah, you can trace back, like a lot of the ancient stories, like the Hopis and the, all the ancient cultures in there. Sort of if you look at, let's say, Graham Hancock's work, where he says, after the Great Flood, these extraterrestrials came and sort of retaught everyone agriculture and civil engineering and things like that. So yeah, perhaps there was, for many millennia, outside assistance. I'm in the modern era, I'm talking about sort of like aliens coming in ships to share technology.
Right. I remember actually just reading, because I've been studying Bitcoin, and I remember somebody actually saying with a certain amount of seriousness, but I guess he might have been half joking, that Satoshi Nakamoto, the mysterious creator of Bitcoin, actually is a person from the future who traveled back into 2009 to drop this technology onto us, because it's nobody really knows his origin, and then just disappeared. And so there's like, this is like infecting our world with the virus of Bitcoin, and hoping to transform things for the future, I suppose. And I was like, okay, that would be fascinating if somehow we could prove it. Now, I'll be honest. I mean, I'm super skeptical about all these ideas. I land in this hard on the skeptic camp, but I'm also, as any smart skeptic, you should keep an open mind and be persuaded by the evidence. And one thing I will say that I do agree with you on is, lately, you have Graham Greene, for example, a physicist who talks about multiverses and multiple universes, that there could be thousands, millions, infinite number of multiple verses and multiverses out there. other universes that we just simply don't interact with or hardly interact with or bury. And the other thing that a lot of people are physicists are struggling to deal with is explaining all the forces. So we have the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, and then we have electromagnetic, and then we have gravity, which is like so much weaker than all the other forces. And physicists posit that perhaps gravity is actually a force that exists in a parallel universe to ours that is somehow overlapping into our universe and having a kind of an influence on it. And this is not just some wacky, crazy physicist proposing this, but several prominent physicists saying gravity is one of the weird forces out there. And maybe a parallel universe is going on where it's kind of infringing on it. So this idea that you kind of threw out there saying, there could be beings or entities or in our room with us. And the other thing, of course, is dark matter, which, our visible matter is like 5% of the known universe. And most of it is either dark energy or dark matter. Well, probably in a couple of centuries, if not sooner, we're going to figure out what that thing is, dark matter. And maybe this crazy, wacky idea, which, by the way, I disagree with you on. I don't think it's all these things, but maybe that is an explanation, and maybe you will be vindicated one day. And I argue, yeah, that's possible. So continue.
Well, and so I would say 2 years ago, right, one of my relatives was like telling me about aliens, and I was like, come on, do you really think they're aliens? And at this point, I have read and seen so much that there's no way I could not hold the beliefs that I have. So I've basically I've shifted my beliefs entirely from thinking aliens are ridiculous to sort of understanding that they're collaborating with people right now.
Okay, so there's alien is a very, very broad term. I mean, alien could be a bacteria that's sitting on Mars, but it could also be a sophisticated, intelligent creature that walks around and that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
so there's a broad spectrum there. So kind of narrow that down and define what you mean by alien.
Yeah, so some people listening to this may be familiar with also channeled beings. So there's Abraham Hicks is super popular on YouTube. There's like it's all over YouTube. You'll find people who can sort of channel from other dimensions. So like a consciousness will come and speak through a person, and there's tens of thousands of examples of people doing this on YouTube. And so a lot of times when you say like, who are you? If a listener were to ask the sort of channeler or the channeled being to say like, who are you? They would say like, oh, we're a 9th dimensional being of light, or we are a 7th dimensional being based in the Andromeda region, or something like that. And so these are sort of entities of consciousness that are no longer in physical form, or that never were in physical form, and they can just sort of project their consciousness anywhere they want at any time, and sort of because they're at higher dimensional levels. So that's why an alien is just a foreigner essentially. So someone who's not based here on planet Earth. So there's also aliens like the little men who come here in spaceships and share ideas with us, and those are sort of your 3-dimensional beings that we can sort of shake hands with, and And
you believe all these different types of aliens, both the kind of more cosmic kind versus the more flesh and blood kind, both of them exist?
Yeah, my understanding is that, even let's say, yes, that if you were to define life as like something that has conscious awareness, that let's say the universe or God is sort of universal consciousness, and that each life form is a small slice of that. It's a fractalization of the larger whole. And then you can have that, separated into all these different, I think there's 12 dimensions is what science has identified. And so I would expect you would find life represented at each dimension.
Okay. No, to repeat, I mean, I'm a big skeptic. So I'm very like incredulous to everything you're saying, Brad, everything. I mean, I'm just like, I'll tell you just how extreme I am. But this is a fascinating conversation because I think this is what's good about podcasting and the internet is to get people who completely disagree to meet up and talk with each other. No, because I mean,
well, I don't know if we disagree either. And I would say, don't take my word for anything, but do your own research.
Okay, fair enough. But in my limited research, I don't do as much as you. But my conclusions are polar opposite of yours. So polar opposite in some respects. But again, this is the value of conversation. In other words, instead of having yelling matches on Twitter and insulting each other, which is not productive, it's better that two people who get together and people can kind of listen to both sides and kind of come to their own conclusion, if you will. So I think this is fantastic. I enjoy really talking about this. But just to give you an idea of how polar opposite I am, I frankly don't think. I think life is fairly abundant in the universe, like microbiological, viruses and little tiny life. And maybe even occasionally you might find a vertebrate type life somewhere in a rare thing. There's a great book called Rare Earth, which talks about actually that multicellular life is highly unlikely anywhere in the universe, and that we may be the only place that has multicellular life, which I think is too extreme, but I'm kind of more down his path. Where I think that technologically intelligent life, because I don't like when people say intelligent life, because I think my dog is intelligent. I think that a mouse is intelligent. And so I say technologically advanced life, somebody who's molded metal and done shit. I think that we may be the only technologically advanced creatures in our galaxy and possibly the entire universe. That's how extreme I am. I'm like way out there. So you're on this one extreme saying that we're visited by all sorts of creatures and there's alien life. And I'm like, no, I think the Milky Way has only one technologically advanced civilization, and it's us.
And what causes you to say that?
Okay, so good question. What causes me to say that is that I think that when you have technology, there's an exponential rise. And if it continues, we're going to be very powerful, either type 1, type 2, or type 3 civilization, if you're familiar with the Kardashev. Okay. So I'm going to mispronounce his name, but it's Kardashev scale of civilization. So a type 0 civilization doesn't use much energy. Type 1 civilization uses all the energy that hits their planet. So right now we're at like a type 0.7. So we're not using all the energy that hits all the solar energy, the wind, and everything. We're not harvesting that. A type 2 civilization uses all the energy that is in the solar system, I believe, or that comes off from the sun. Yeah, basically all the solar. So that means that we would harness and grab all the energy from the sun. And a type 3 civilization is when you harvest and use all the energy of the galaxy. So those are the three different levels of civilization based on energy utilization. It was a Russian scientist who came up with this thing about probably 80 years ago or something like that. And so once you get to our level, you can imagine that it's going to be a pretty quick ride, relatively speaking, in order to become a type 1 civilization, and then eventually expand into the stars and start to harness all the energy of our sun. And from space, Derek, you can see the impact that human beings have on our planet. You can see the fields of agriculture that we've transformed. So you can see these nice little blocks, the crop circles or whatever. You can see how we've diverted rivers, made dams. You can see that from space, from orbit. In the same way, I think that we should be able to see the diversion and the odd anomalies that are almost impossible to explain by known physics. We should be able to see that in the heavens, so that when suddenly we would see, let's say, a star's orbit suddenly go retrograde and do something completely different, or that we expect a star that's moving a certain way to like suddenly disappear for really no apparent reason, Because why? Because a super advanced civilization ought to be having the energy and the power to harness and divert rivers of energy in the sky. So we should be able to observe all sorts of odd phenomena that we really have no idea in the heavens. And as far as I know, maybe, of course, I'm ignorant, but it doesn't seem that we've ever observed something that says, wow, that's completely different. Unless, of course, you submit that a black hole is something, is a machine that civilizations have created, for example, or just star creation is generally a machine that a civilization has boosted and is making it like a factory of stars, if you look at it that way. But I think we can explain those phenomena with general science and evolution of the solar system and the cosmos. Anyway, back to you.
I would say that, one, there's probably a ton of evidence already that we see manipulation in our solar system. If again, you were to sort of look for it, for example, we thought the rings of Saturn were unchanging, but it looks like they're being built and changing minute to minute if you look at sort of video footage. There's one example. Another example that's totally, I'm not sure where I stand on this, but ancient cultures have oral traditions and histories of a time before the moon. And if you look at the physics of the moon, it's in this sort of perfectly manufactured tidal lock where you never see the dark side of the moon. And what I've come to understand, and this is from, again, like hundreds of interviews of people that sort of study this, is that the moon is an ark, like a Noah's Ark that was deliberately placed into orbit some time ago around Earth. And that it's all, you can find evidence like it weighs 65% less than it should. And there's no previous observation of such a large moon orbiting such a small planet, and all these different anomalies, and including 3D sort of architectural looking structures on images of the moon, and all these things that would, you could say, compile evidence that the moon is a large piece of technology.
Okay, which is interesting because that reminds me of 2001: Space Odyssey, where you have the monolith.
Yeah, and so there's actually this great NASA images of basically that monolith on Mars. There's, they've estimated that it's like 4 miles tall. You can search for images of monolith on Mars. I believe it's on Mars and not the moon. But anyway, it looks exactly like the 2001 monolith, which I was pretty blown away when I saw that. It's
interesting. I saw this book that was written, I want to say in the 1970s, maybe 1980s. And it's about the face on Mars. Are you familiar with the face on Mars?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so...
Oh, actually, yeah.
There was a picture. It was a very grainy, fuzzy picture taken by one of the early Mars exploring vehicles that we sent out there. I don't remember if it was the Viking or what it was that took that picture. And it looks like a human face. And this guy wrote an entire fat book, like a 400 or 500 page book, kind of like analyzing it, speculating on it, talking about the civilization that built this face and da-da-da-da-da. Okay, that was all happening in the 70s or 80s. And then in this century, 21st century, we started imaging much sharper resolution with the Mars explorers that we sent out there.
Yep.
And it turns out that fuzzy looking face actually doesn't look at all like a face once it's in high resolution. And
or where the shadows are different or something like that.
Exactly.
Yep.
And I've thought to myself, I wonder how it would be to be that guy's wife. Because the guy's wife was probably just, he sees her husband spending untold hours analyzing this fuzzy image and coming up with all sorts of theories and that kind of stuff. And then suddenly dispelled more or less overnight and she probably yelled at him, "Why did you waste all that time? Why didn't you just wait for a better resolution of that photo? It's obviously a hoax and a fake and da 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 da." And he's like feeling like an idiot, like, damn it, I should have waited I should have waited for a better resolution.
Or maybe that was like the best part of his life, when he felt like he was on the cutting edge and he was finding joy every day in piecing together ideas. And if you really think about it, like, what is the ultimate point of us as humans being here? And it's it's to experience things. And if we're experiencing what we want and moving away from what we don't want, like that's some of the most important work we can be doing. So I would actually think that that was really great that he did it, even if he was eventually disproven, you know.
Yeah, no, I agree with you that there's certain, you know, he certainly lived his life with passion during those years where he was examining it, for sure. I personally would feel like shit, I just spent all this time doing this stuff and in the end just got disproven in one fell swoop. But that's different. What about Occam's razor? Have you heard of Occam's
Sure.
razor?
The simplest explanation.
Yeah, the simplest explanation is often the correct one. And so let's say, for example, you mentioned the moon and that it could have been artificially placed there and that kind of stuff. Like there's other explanations, I think. I'm not a cosmologist, but I think there's certainly some credible theories placed by traditional astronomers to explain why the moon is the way it is. And to me, usually I think most of those explanations seem to be the simplest one. So I apply Occam's razor and say that versus coming up with an alternative explanation, which is one of the ones you kind of suggested before as a possibility. How do you kind of use Occam's razor, or when do you ignore it?
Well, if, I would say if you want to compare two theories, right, then you would have to fully understand why each of them makes sense and then say which one really is the simplest. And because there's probably like a many factorial, there's like, here's 10 pieces of evidence why it's a natural rock. And here's 10 pieces of evidence why it's a machine that was placed there in geosynchronous orbit or, a satellite. Then you sort of have to take like the probability of each thing in aggregate and say which is more likely. And it's pretty impossible to do, right? So I don't know. At this point, I would say there's no great way to apply Occam's razor in this sense, because in one sense, it's just someone putting it there is the simplest explanation.
Sure. No, absolutely. It kind of reminds me of Adam and Eve. I mean, it's just like the simplest explanation. Well, God, what's simpler than just saying that Adam and Eve were created by God and just boom, just placed there? It's a simple idea. Come on, what the hell? This whole evolution that we come from microbes and we evolved from amphibians and we came out of the earth. God, what a complicated explanation. Darwinian theory is just like, sounds like complete bullshit and just like crazy idea. It's so much more simple to just say that there was a God that just placed Adam and Eve and created all the creatures and just threw them on the earth, and that's it. That's a simple explanation. It's true. Yeah.
So it's what I expect to happen is that so part of my understanding is that we're passing, like our solar system and Earth is passing through a field in the Milky Way right now. Which is part of a 62.5 million year cycle. And every 62.5 million years in the fossil record, you see these huge jumps in evolution from, let's say, mollusks to fish, or from, all of a sudden trees show up, or all of a sudden, so you see these like punctuated moments where evolution accelerates much, much quicker. And so I'm not sure exactly what's happening, but perhaps like the field we're passing through, which by the way is causing global warming on every planet simultaneously right now in our solar system, all the way out to Uranus and Venus, like every planet is experiencing the same sort of global warming that we are. And so we're passing through this either a gravitational field or electromagnetic field created by the black hole in the center, a sort of a pulse field that we sort of orbit through. And where am I going with this? That we are going
around. By the way, it is true that we are orbiting. Our solar system is orbiting around the galaxy, and maybe many people may not even know that or realize that yes, we go around the sun, but the sun goes around the entire Milky Way galaxy in its spiral arm. Continue.
Yeah, and so the theory is that as we pass through this field every 62.5 million years, you get these sort of like huge steps in evolution of the complexity of species on the planet. And so it may be slightly different than the sort of like gradual evolutionary process that sort of Darwin was imagining.
I see. Yeah, I mean, but I do think there is, I can't remember the biologist who was talking about punctuated equilibriums. In other words, kind of like evolution jumping in steps. And that's not necessarily against Darwin. It just, one interpretation of Darwin, and I don't think Darwin was explicit about whether it's a smooth kind of linear curve or whether it goes in a stair-step fashion. Either way, I think it could work with Darwinism, and it makes sense. I mean, that there's these moments of just extreme innovation, especially when there's an extreme change in the environment. So I don't think that that's anti-Darwin by any means. So what do you think are these? So you believe that there's potential rocket ships or spaceships, I guess, flying around, which I completely don't agree with. But explain to me, like, I guess the purpose is unknowable. Like, we just don't know why they're here. There could be a myriad of reasons, right?
So so there's a few things I want to comment there. After I started dreaming about crop circles and then started looking up, just on YouTube, videos of UFOs. But just a couple days after I started dreaming of crop circles, the Navy released their footage, and this was on New York Times, CNN, everything, like, hey, here's a UFO that was like interacting with our battle carrier group. And, just a couple weeks ago, the Navy released, the Pentagon said, we have a whole program studying UFOs. Here's a bunch more footage. Other governments have these UFO like defense programs. So then I'm like, okay, all the world's governments are tracking UFOs. So, okay, that was sort of the next step for me. And, hearing these pilots say, like, it accelerated from 0 to 70,000 miles an hour in a second. Well, that's not jet technology. That's not a technology that we have. But I've heard many scientists talk about how you can create gravitational drives and how that would be possible. And that seems likely to be what they're using, is not jet propulsion, but rather a field generated around a ship that allows it to operate in its own sort of gravity and therefore eliminates things like wind resistance and water resistance and sort of move at these extra fast speeds. And that technology apparently is quite simple to replicate.
Well, I mean, when you say quite simple, I guess once you know how to do it.
Right. And so you said, what is the point of these aliens coming here? So in the 1930s, they started interacting, my understanding is, with many of the sort of the pre-Nazi, like, German secret societies were the first to interact with these aliens. And they said, here's how you do gravity drive technology. And that's when they learned. And so a big mission, it sounds like, is all the aliens that I've heard of love Earth because it's so special. And they all are cheering for us to stop fighting, to start working together more as a collective of humanity. And they all, let's say 95% of them, want to help us in that process. And that's why that they are here. And so when you hear these, messages from people who've experienced abduction or from people that work in these programs, like space programs, the message that I hear over and over again is that, like, we are, and this pandemic is perhaps a symptom of that. Like, we have the opportunity right now to come together as a collective species. And that's why I'm aware of that this is happening, is because more and more people are starting to get contacted and have it be brought into their awareness that we have this opportunity before us and we must sort of rise to the occasion.
Okay. Why these, I mean, aliens are obviously much more powerful than we are, technologically speaking, at least. Why don't they just throw down the hammer and just impose martial law and just say, okay, damn it, we want your place to succeed. We're going to make it happen. Because there's a universal law that each entity has to have free will. And so you can encourage and you can help, but you can't take something away. You can't take away someone's free will, and that will have consequences for whoever takes away someone else's free will. Which, we've seen, right? Like, people do bad things on Earth, like, ultimately it comes back to bite them, right? So ultimately, like, we have to get to a better place on our own. So you're not allowed to, sort of theoretically, galactically, you're not allowed to just interfere in that sense. Derek, what do you think is our future in this century? In other words, do you think that there's going to be some monumental discovery down the pipe?
Yeah, a few things, I think, within the next, even so this year, 2020, I think more and more governments will just sort of declassify their UFO programs, and we'll just learn more. I don't know when we'll see aliens walking in the streets, because honestly, I think that would be super scary for most people. I think it would just blow our minds too much.
Well, some people say that they're already walking on our streets, that they're among us, that Elon Musk is an alien himself.
Well, let's say use an alien that looks different.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Like a non-human alien. That would just... Okay. Or
biological, or maybe... That's the other thing is, like, I don't think, you see a lot of alien stories. I really don't think that an alien will be biological in nature. I would think it would be almost all synthetic.
Yeah, perhaps there's, the whole range, like, because we were talking about light entities, perhaps there's biological and then, sort of your cyborgs and your lights, but I haven't heard as much about the sort of, because what I hear is that the more you develop your consciousness, the less technology you need. All of a sudden you can take care of everything through applied consciousness and applied thought rather than having a machine need to do it for you. So I think right now humans are, really good at like tinkering and innovating and stuff like that on sort of like a machine level. But I think by the end of this century, our consciousness will have progressed that will move past needing a lot of machines.
Whoa, you're saying machines are going to go down by the wayside? We're going to become Luddites?
I don't think that's. I think like if you can just sort of like travel through teleportation with your mind, then why drive a car, for example? And yeah, I think there's this expression that I've heard, like, the more technology you have, the less technology you need. So like imagine like every piece of technology just being still condensed into the iPhone, more and more and more. And then the iPhone being condensed down into just like a little like a necklace that everybody wears. And all the technology is just in one single little thing, and it just does everything for you. I kind of expect that's the direction we'll go.
Now, a lot of times, I studied religion. That's my degree in religion, but yet I'm an atheist at this point. After having studied so many religions, I studied it so hard, I was like, oh, screw this. I can't believe any one of them. So I started off religious, but I became atheist in the end. And sometimes people, I wonder, like, what would it take for me to become religious? And sometimes I'm like, well, if there's a big booming voice in the sky saying, I am Allah and the Quran is the right thing, and, believe me, then I'd be like, okay, that's probably, if I really can't find any other explanation, I could maybe come to the conclusion that that is the legitimate religion, and that we should all become Muslims. But barring that, it's going to be very hard to convince me otherwise that one religion is the right religion. It's hard because I've studied it so profoundly. But regarding aliens, like, I think that if I saw an alien, like a spaceship landing, and I could touch and feel, and just like, and not just me, but like massive community, like you have all sorts of scientists get to see and meet, and it's like it's well documented from a variety of angles, variety of cultures, not these like isolated incidents that depend on the testimony of just one or two people. Then that would change my mind. Mm-hmm. And then I would be like, okay, got it. Here is irrefutable evidence that there are indeed aliens here. So my question to you, Derek, is what would make you change your mind regarding aliens or crop circles or whatever that make you say, you know what, actually, Francis is his instincts are more right. In fact, this is bullshit. This is like, there's no truth to this. I'm going to give up my thing and say this. It's hard. I think in some ways it's hard because you're trying to prove a negative. Like, it's really hard. Like, I can't disprove you. All mm-hmm. your arguments, I can't really disprove you. It's kind of like trying to prove a negative. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like you trying to disprove to a Muslim like that Allah is not the real God out there, mm-hmm. and that Muhammad was not a messenger. You can't. It's almost hard. It's almost impossible to prove that.
Sure.
Or that Jesus was whatever. So, but still, is there anything, I guess my question to you in my long-winded way is to say, Derek, is there anything that would convince you? What evidence or what would have to happen for you to then suddenly change your ideas completely and say, you know what, abandoning all this, and I'm going to say, you know what, the moon is the moon, and the crop circle is the crop circle. It's just all this is natural, quote unquote, natural phenomena, and not any supernatural explanation. What would have to happen? Like what would convince you? What would change your mind?
Well, I'm not sure that, I don't know. It would have to be, right, like a huge body of evidence over many years that is more compelling, right? So just like you said, you would have to like see it and interact and hear stories and have scientists confirm and all these things. Well, like, that's the point. That's the point where I am, right? So like I was where you are 2 years ago, and after like studying all the evidence, I'm where I am now. So
really, in just 2 years, you've made a 180?
I wouldn't say it was a 180. It's like if you never knew something, right? If you didn't know about something, and then someone just was like, "Hey, you want to go to a jazz club?" And all of a sudden you're like, "Oh my God, jazz is amazing!" And you studied jazz and you started playing it and you just started learning about it. It's just like diving into a world I didn't know about. And I would say also it doesn't matter whether I change my mind or not, because ultimately, like, what's important is, right, our own experience and our own progression through life. And, let's go back to like a message that comes from, again, all these aliens that are trying to help the planet. They say like the most important thing, right, is that you start to be more helpful to other people. And, that's like, let's say that's a more important thing than, what conclusions you reach or what evidence you get, is if you arrive in this place where you're operating from a state of peace, where you're no longer doing things like numbing out with alcohol or Netflix, but you're really living your full experience on Earth as a human. You're experiencing the full range of emotions and learning the lessons that you're here to learn. Like, ultimately, that is much more important than whether you understand some piece of science or some piece of religion or culture or anything like that.
Okay, well said. I mean, yeah, it is important to be fulfilled and to have purpose in your own life, and that, I guess, is monumental. The funny thing is that you have your life is completely different than what we've been talking about. I appreciate you because you've revealed a side of yourself that you admit you've basically almost never revealed or rarely revealed. Because talk to the listeners about just the normal side of Derek. Like, what's your day job?
So we learned a little bit that I used to be a scientist. So that's like a normal day for me is I'm training entrepreneurs. I'm a business coach for entrepreneurs, digital nomads, thought leaders, authors, speakers, trainers. And so, I traveled the world kind of like you did, and looking at business in different countries. And so there's, four basic, when I'm coaching, when I'm training, there's, these four different aspects of myself that I bring into my work. One is adventure, which has always been a part of my life. One is metaphysics and all of these, and the science that I'm studying now, and how we can apply, consciousness to business and sort of, everything I'm learning about physics and metaphysics and spirituality and aliens and all this stuff. I want to be able to apply it to people right now so that they can grow a business that impacts, the future positively. So I'm also looking at the world of mental mastery and peak performance from essentially, high performing executives and Olympic athletes and pro sports and stuff. So I'm bringing that in as well. And then the fourth aspect is, let's see, so we got business, metaphysics, let's say spirituality, and adventure. Yeah. So those are the four pieces of how I weave together the training that I do for entrepreneurs.
Yeah, that's very different. Well, not all of it. Metaphysics obviously fits in nicely in that. And I read last night your book Superconductors, which I thought was very good.
Thank you.
I feel like, when you're a chef, you spend, let's say, all day cooking this meal, and then somebody wolfs it down in like 15 or 20 minutes, and you're like, fuck, I just spent the entire goddamn day making this thing, and then all of a sudden you wolf it down in 15 minutes, and that's, you probably spent years writing your book, and then all of a sudden I just read it in one night, and I'm like, God. You're like, I spent a lot of time on that, Francis. You just run through it so fast. But it's actually a very readable book because you break it out into sections. So Superconductors is a great business book. It's a great self-help book, I think. It's easy if you hit a section that is not applied to you. You can skip it or slow it, and it's very modular in that fashion. So that's what I think made it super easy to read. No section is that long, so you don't get bogged down. And there's a lot of practical how-to steps throughout the whole book. So I commend you on having written that, and I hope you do successful. I'll put a link in it in the podcast notes. And for those who are curious, it has absolutely nothing to do with all the metaphysics and the things that we've been talking about today. It's a completely different side of Derek that is, I guess, more quote unquote down to earth.
Yeah. And, ultimately, like, I wrote that book because I want, so you can read books and you can understand concepts, but until you apply them and know what it's like to be a person who is, let's say learning, we talked about learning at the beginning of the episode, like, until you understand what it's like to be a beginner over and over again and sort of acquire skills quickly, you can get it conceptually, but until you have that sort of lived experience of these things that I'm talking about in the book. So one thing that's important to me in the books or the training, the coaching that I'm doing, is getting people to the place where they actually experience the knowledge that they're learning so that they can sort of come to deeply understand that and have it impact their lives. Yeah, no,
that's, it's fascinating. And one thing I also want to mention is that I think that religions, when you compare it to the cutting edge physics, I think cutting edge physics is much more fascinating than religions. Because they're exploring nowadays multidimensional things, dark matter, dark energy, wild, crazy ideas that are, to me, much, much more wacky than the Bible. Much crazier concepts to try to digest. And these are real life physicists seriously going about their business of understanding string theory and Planck's length and, just stuff that is the realm of the super small or the realm of the super big, and black holes and cosmologists, to me is such a fascinating and unknown field. It's just amazing how ignorant we are regarding so many things about physics. And so that's why I leave the door open to the wacky ideas, what I think are wacky ideas that you've kind of alluded to or mentioned today. But I respect you. I mean, I'm like, okay, you might be right. So far we've proven ourselves astoundingly ignorant about reality. What people believed in the 19th century is completely off base of what we believe today about so many issues. So what's to say that in the 23rd century we're going to look like ignoramuses, that we have no idea what this is? I mean, it's true.
It probably will happen. Yeah, one way or
another. Exactly. It must happen. Yeah, I mean, it's going to happen. Like in 23rd century, we're going to be laughing our asses off about how little we knew as Homo sapiens and how ignorant and all the silly little ideas. You guys thought broccoli was good for you. Anyway, so I appreciate all your time, Derek. And where can people find more about you?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. DerekLoudermilk.com. And my podcast is The Art of Adventure. And on that show, actually, so I, in my sort of exploration of these topics, I've started seeking out practitioners, energy healers or hypnotists or channelers, people who are more on the metaphysical side. And I've been getting like a personal session with them so I can understand what it's like to have a Reiki healing session or a crystal resonance therapy session. And then I interview the practitioner about essentially the science behind their work. So I'm doing a whole series now on looking at these different sort of non-traditional modalities to do my due diligence, essentially. So if you liked what we were talking about, you might like some of these episodes over there.
I am subscribed to your podcast, and I'm trying to keep an open mind, and I encourage everybody else to do the same. And that concludes this episode of the WanderLearn podcast, where we explore travel, technology, and transformation. If you'd like to see the show notes with links to what we talked about, or if you'd like to comment on the show, or if you'd like to ask me a question, then go to WanderLearn.com and click on this episode. If you'd like to connect with me, just remember Tapon. That's my first initial and my last name. Tapon is the username I use on all social media. You can also get to my website by going to ftapon.com. And here's one last reason to remember Tapon. If you like what I do and would like to get rewarded for supporting my projects, then go to patreon.com/ftapon. That's where you can pick up some remarkable rewards for as little as $2 a month. And now for 5 quick favors. Number 1, subscribe to the WanderLearn podcast. 2, download it. 3, share it. 4, review it somewhere. And 5, sign up for my newsletter at WanderLearn.com. Our theme music was composed by Eric Stratman. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.